Okay, now we move to part 5 of our study of organizational behavior, and we'll be starting with chapter 15 when we look at managing communication processes. We want to define the term, again, communication, look at the major elements involved in a communication process. We'll talk a lot about nonverbal cues and how they influence the communication effectiveness. We'll compare different types of interpersonal communication, and we'll look at barriers to effective communication. First of all, when we look at communication in organization, it's the process by which things get done in organizations. So one of the things that have been taking over our global companies have been global virtual team communication. These tend to be cross-functional. They operate across time. They operate across different space. They do have organizational boundaries and cultures, but the members mainly communicate with each other through electronic technologies and may never even actually meet each other face-to-face. Internationally savvy companies will provide their virtual teams with intercultural training because there can be so many problems and misunderstandings across cultures. When we look at developing an intercultural communication training program, some of the benefits to this will be to help recognize the differences in cultural beliefs and how that might facilitate or inhibit good communication. We might look at the differences, particularly if we're using video conferencing, on verbal and nonverbal communication styles. And we'll understand the differences between different cultures on attitudes towards time, space, and a work ethic. A second part of a training would focus on how you learn to work with teammates in different cultures. So first we understand their culture, and then we look at ways that we can work within the culture, how we interpret their communication styles, and how we might, because of that interpretation, be able to work with them and respond effectively to the cues that we recognize across communications. Why is communication important? It's vital for a communication process in order for work to be done. We have different levels of communication from person to person. We have nation to nation. We have in organizations, and we have within groups. And every day a manager is communicating, whether it's verbally or non-verbally. It's one of the most important aspects of communication. It's also the reason why organizations fail. If we look at all of the research that's done, it's usually because of communication problems and not necessarily because of financial or organizational structure. It's very important that we focus on the whole forces involved with communication. Look at the people, look at the surroundings. Nearly all aspects of a manager's job involves communication. When we look at the communication process, it's very much almost like a engineering model of input-output. Who's communicating, who says what, how do they say it, and how's it received, and then the feedback loop of what happens and what effect that has on the communication process. The classic communication model that you'll often see is here's the communicator, some of the factors in terms of how they frame or send a message, how that message is and what medium they send it through, whether it's face-to-face or technology-wise, how the receiver receives it and decodes it and interprets it, and then the feedback. Now, if you look at the little purple dots within the model there, those are little noise factors that we'll be talking about filters and biases and so forth. When we look at the classic communication model, we have someone who communicates their ideas, their intentions. We have the message being converted to groups or symbols that might represent those ideas. We have the overall message that the sender wants to communicate. We have the mode by which the message is sent. Then we have the target of the message and how they go about decoding it. The receiver converts these symbols into their own concepts and ideas. And again, the noise that we talked about are the factors that distort the intended message. Then we have feedback, where the receiver's response to the sender's message goes. So it works two ways. Nonverbal communication is that. It's not words. And probably the research has shown that probably 75 to 95% of our communication is nonverbal. And even trying not to communicate by not having any kind of action is actually nonverbal communication. People cannot refrain from behaving nonverbally. Even if they act passively, they're likely to be perceived as being withdrawn or rigid or not very friendly. Speakers with great vocal and facial pleasantness and facial expressiveness were often judged by audiences to be more competent just by the way they presented themselves. Also, vocal inflection, whether you have raise your voice or talk in a monotone, refers to how a message is actually transmitted. We have other things that in nonverbal communication around emblems, illustrators, regulators, adapters, how that affect is displayed. When we're communicating across cultures, like when we were talking about preparing a cross-cultural training, we would look at the kind of words people use, the kind of space they interact in, of how close they are in proximity, how they see time in terms of something to be managed or to work in, or something that manages them, and the behaviors that are relevant in different cultures. We have communication flowing upwards and downwards in an organization. When we have downward communication, it flows from the senior level down to lower levels. And these include things like policies, instructions, memos. When we have upward communication, it flows from the lower levels of the organizations on up. These would be things like suggestion boxes, grievances, different emails, websites, all of those kind of things would be upward flow of communication. We have ways in which we communicate through technology, and a lot of you are familiar with these when we look at the web, when we look at the intranet that occurs inside organizations. We have voicemail, we have video conferencing. A lot of people are very dependent and use heavily their mobile phones or PDAs, and we have instant messaging and email. Another aspect that we have in organization is a phenomenon known as the grapevine, and it's really an informal communication channel that actually cuts across all other channels of communication. It's kind of like nonverbal communication. You can't not have a grapevine. Employees listen to things and then they spread rumors and ideas in this grapevine. Some organizations have multiple grapevine systems of how information is distributed throughout the organization. It's deeply ingrained in the organizational cultures, and managers really should be tuned in to what's being said, and almost can use the grapevine to keep people informed of what's going on. We have another area known as rumors that travel through the grapevine, and some of the categories of rumors that you'll read about have to do with things like a pipe dream or a wish, where it might be expressed and then those are spread throughout the organization, that they may want a certain level of sales or a new product developed or something. Or bogey type rumors that employees start out of fear and anxiety, and they cause people to feel uneasy or nervous about their jobs. We have very aggressive type of rumors known as wedge drivers that are motivated by people who that have grudges to bear, or they might have some kind of hatred toward and want to damage somebody. And then we have sort of home stretches that are sort of anticipatory rumors that they say, hey, they're going to announce a raise or a new client or a merger or acquisition or something, where they're waiting for an announcement. When we look at interpersonal communication, we look at the flow between people face-to-face and a group. This could be the primary means of managerial communication. 3/4 of managers' communications occur in face-to-face interaction. Problems that can arise when we have this type of communication are there might be perceptual differences between the manager and the individuals in groups, and there might be different levels of style that are interpreted differently in how communication is sent and received. When we look at interpersonal communication style, we're looking at how an individual prefers to relate to others, whether it's quiet or whether it's aggressive, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's through technologies and so forth. One of the models that is in your book about communication is the Johari window, and if we go to the next slide, it shows you some of the things about if you look at it in your book about areas that are known by the self and known by others, and they refer to these as the arena where you know who you are and others know who you are, and the blind spot where you may not know something, but it is known by others, and that's your blind spot, where somebody might say something to you that you had no understanding of. And it's kind of a nice little model to look at in terms of sort of understanding how well you communicate. When we look at interpersonal communication strategies, we can improve our ability to communicate. It's not something that's fixed, by our exposure to others, training, and getting feedback on how we listen and how we interpret things. A lot of this depends on managerial styles, and all managers do provide some kind of information, They do give commands and instructions, and they do make efforts to persuade and influence, like we've talked about in our leadership chapters. How these managers communicate as senders and receivers is really critical to the overall performance of the organization. We've defined some types of managers by A, B, C, and D. An A manager tends to appear aloof and cold, and they're not really good communicators. They use exposure or feedback, so people really don't know how they stand with the type A manager. The type B manager tends to be very permissive. They really want to have good relationships, but they're not able to really communicate clearly, task. The type C manager tends to think a lot of themselves, but they don't listen very well to others, and they tend to have subordinates that tend to be rebellious and distrustful. And type D is pretty much defined as the most effective manager, because there's a balance between managers that express their feelings and also listen to the ideas and experiences of others. We have barriers to effective communication. We go back to our basic communication model of communication, encoding and decoding, and what happens at the message. How is it filtered? How is it received? How is it sent and managed, and so forth. Some of the barriers that are created by senders is they might use language that's not understandable by other people. They might filter it by saying, oh, these people don't have the education or training, or they might think about age and gender. They might use a language that is unfamiliar to the receiver. They might have status differences, either lower status or upper status, and they might be so pressured about time that they weren't careful about how they framed the message. In terms of barriers that can be created by the receivers themselves, they might selectively listen, not hear everything that's been sent to them because they're tired or they're just listening to key words. Or they might have value judgments like, oh, I don't really want to listen to this person because of their culture or their gender or their experience, so they don't pay as much attention. Or they might look at the person themselves and say, hey, the credibility is not as highly valued as, so I don't really need to listen as well. Some of the barriers that are created by both the sender and the receiver has to do with the frame of reference that they have in regards to the other, and the proxemics, the behavior that they have in terms of how close they are, how far the way they are from the sender or the receiver, and whether they're actually on communication overload, that there might be just too much information coming at them and being able to process that, which is something that's happening in a lot of organizations these days. How can we improve organizational communication? We have managers that are striving to become much better communications, and they need to do two things. They need to be mindful about the messages they transmit, and they need to improve their understanding of the people that they're working with and who they're trying to communicate, so they understand a lot of the cultural dynamics. Some of the ways to improve our communication is by narrowing that communication gap that we identified in one of our previous slides. One of those things is to follow up to make sure that the other understood it. We need to ensure optimum flow of information so that people get the amount of information, the kind of information that they need. We always need to allow for feedback. We need to put ourselves in the place of others and show empathy. We sometimes need to repeat some things so that people have a chance to hear something they may not have heard the first time. We need to create a trusting work environment, and we need to time it so that people are ready to receive it. And we need to use language that is understandable by both parties or all those involved. And one of the biggest things that they're showing in research is listening skills. We need to actively listen to what the sender is actually saying.